All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Leadership Blend with your host, Ricardo D. Rice. And today we're going to take a look at delegation. So when I briefly went over it the last time, people had a lot of questions. It's a very big issue for a lot of leaders and a lot of managers about when to delegate, what do I delegate, what shouldn't I delegate, what is delegation. So I decided to do this actual episode on delegation, what it is, how it works, why you should do it, how beneficial it is for your organization. So that's what we're going to do. On last week, we took a look at emotional intelligence. With emotional intelligence, it was a look at all about emotions. You know, the emotions of the leader, the emotions of the organizational members, the emotions of your parishioners if we're talking about ministry. And hopefully from last week's episode, you got the understanding that emotions play a very big part in the overall success of your organization. Because at the end of the day, for everything that you go through within your organization, emotions are going to be at the forefront. Whether it be people being angry about something or whether it be people being happy about some things, there's always a wide range of emotions that people are going to experience when you're making decisions and making moves on behalf of your organization. So this week, again, we're going to get into delegations. So here's a couple of questions I want you to ask yourself before we get into it, before I get into delegation. Number one, are you working a lot of hours and your employees are going home on time? Number two, do you have a work backlog, or for people like myself, we say our plates are running over, or we just have a plethora of work on our desk that we haven't been able to get to? Number three, are you doing things your employees should be doing, and it could be at a lower cost? Now, if you're a volunteer organization, then of course the question becomes, are you doing things, and the fact that you have a small amount of volunteers, is it not enough? Or is it because they're not being productive enough? Because you can have 6 people and get the work done of 30 people if they're all being productive. Number 4, are you doing things that you're not exactly an expert at? Number 5, are you doing work that is a level below your job title? For those of you that are executive directors, are you doing the work of a volunteer? Meaning you're actually working the programmed events, you're not having time for administration. When I was asking about things that you're not an expert at, some of us are self-made. So I will say with myself, there are a lot of things that I do and I've taught myself to do, which I will not tell you is a bad thing. But at the same token, I also know my parameters. So case in point with my teams, we all know I have 3 teams. There are certain things on the radio that I don't do because that's not my area. Simone does. With the TV, there are certain things I don't get into because that's what Nikki does. With the magazine, there are certain things I don't get into because that's what Josh does. So I understand the parameters of what I can and cannot do, which is vital when it comes to delegation. But we'll get into that. Number 3, when I was saying, are you doing something that's at a lower cost? For those of you that are not paying your employees and they're volunteers, we get into productivity, which I touched on really quickly a few minutes ago. Having 6 people that can do the work of 30. Now, granted, with that ideology, you want to be careful because if you are paying your employees, that can be detrimental. When you strip down a particular branch of your organization from 20 people to 3 and you're still paying them the same thing, then you can create a whole other level of frustration that you do not want to encounter. So this is strictly in a volunteer capacity and it deals with productivity. Having the mindset that you have 6 volunteers where we can do the work of 20 or 30 because we're that productive. Number 2, the backlog issue. Is there a whole desk full of stuff that you have not been able to get to because you're trying to do your work as well as the employees' work or your work as well as the volunteer work? That's a problem. And number 1, are your employees leaving and going home on time and you're still staying in the office for another 5 hours because, again, you're doing their work as well as your work? So those are all questions I want to get your mind going on because we're talking about delegation, which is vital for every organization to survive. And when I spoke about the last time, I really was talking about the succession and the succession plan in general. The ideology that if somebody steps off the scene that's a prime member of your leadership team, is your organization going to crumble? Because nobody has been properly delegated to step up to the plate in the unfortunate demise of someone or the death of someone or the promotion of someone. I use the example about apostles in ministry because I like to give examples specifically for ministry. Having the apostle. Well, if you have a pastor who decided that God has elevated them to be an apostle, they're eventually going to have to leave the scene and stop pastoring that church. Is there somebody that has been delegated or tasked to be able to step up to the pastorship in the elevation of the apostle? Oftentimes the answer is no. Or you see the adverse. I see the adverse a lot of times where there is an assistant pastor, a pastor, but the assistant pastor never gets the opportunity to practice being the pastor. That's also a recipe for disaster. It has to be a scenario where your vice or your assistant pastor understands the tasks and the duties of the pastor, and not only understands them, but actually gets the opportunity to execute those particular tasks. And I used last week or the week before that when we were talking about the pastor doing things like not only just preaching, but doing some evangelizing, officiating ceremonies. There are specific tasks that can be delegated to an assistant pastor that they can actually not only take the weight off the pastor, but also get the practice and the experience of being able to do it, so that when the pastor steps off the scene, they're able to step up, and it's a smooth transition versus it being a turbulent one, which I'm seeing a lot more of. So in that same example, you want to make sure that the assistant pastor, which operates as a VP, is able to do the tasks and the duties of the pastor. So again, you can slide over some abilities or some responsibilities, such as officiating ceremonies. So let's say there are 5 ceremonies in that month, and the pastor and the assistant pastor sit down and say, okay, I'm going to do 3 of these, and you're going to do the other 2. And while you do the other 2, I'm going to be there to make sure that you do them correctly and make sure you do them procedurally the right way. Christening babies. You say, hey, we have 3 or 4 baby christenings this month. I'm going to do 2, you do 2, and I'm going to make sure when you do yours, I'm going to be there, and vice versa. And again, I use biblically. We see this all the time throughout the Bible. Elijah and Elisha, Joshua and Moses. You see this all throughout the Bible. So it is spiritual, so it is natural. Those same expectations have to be held within your organization, be it ministry or otherwise. All right, so let's get into delegation. Number 1, evaluate what you can and cannot do. Strengths and weaknesses. I always tell people, for those of you that have gone into business like myself, we always talk about the SWOT analysis, which is strength, weaknesses, opportunity, and threats. It's always a good thing to do for a leader, to understand those dynamics. Your strengths. What do you do well? For myself, I know that leadership is one thing. Delegation is something I'm actually really good at. I learned that early on because it makes my life easier. But delegation, leadership, those are all things that I'm good at. Administration, those are all things that I'm good at. When it comes to what I'm less good at or my weaknesses, I'm not very passive. So there are certain conversations I may not be able to have. So I will get other people to have them. Case in point, there's a TV debacle and I'm really heated in the moment. I probably will step away and let Nikki have the conversation for me. And then there's certain things that she takes the heat on so that I don't have to directly deal with the staff, because I know how I am and she knows how I am as well. So I understand my weaknesses, my opportunities. When I decipher what my strengths and my weaknesses are, those opportunities is where delegation comes in. Because now that I realize what I can do and what I can't do, there's the opportunity to train somebody up to do those things that I cannot do and to learn the things that I can do. So those are those opportunities. And then, of course, the threats, which is not necessarily needed, but you still want to keep them in mind. For me, the threats would be leaning too much and knocking off the balance in my personal life and my professional life. Having conversations that I normally don't like to have, but I need to have as a leader. Things of that magnitude. So the SWOT analysis, then that'll be good. So remember that. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Very good, especially if you need to do a business plan or a marketing plan. That is something that goes into both of them. So you definitely want to understand that. Number 2, defer when you need to. Delegation, again, very great. Understanding what you cannot do, I cannot stress this enough. Understanding what you cannot do becomes important because you have to be able to understand what you can and cannot delegate. There are certain things I cannot delegate because they have to be done by me. Reciprocally, there are other things that do not have to be done by me, and I'm just accustomed to doing them, but I can delegate them out to somebody else so they can get the experience and get the understanding of how to do them. Okay, so when we left, I was talking about evaluating what you can and can't do. And I was talking about the SWOT analysis, strength, weaknesses, opportunity, and threats. And when we left, I was talking about defer to when you need to. Okay, so here's the thing. Keeping in mind that you have to understand, well, let me say this. First and foremost, as a leader, your primary objective out the gate should be understanding the strengths and weaknesses of your team. That has to be a priority for you, because when it comes to delegation, I cannot delegate a task to someone that cannot do it. You as a leader have to understand the parameters of your employees and of the volunteers in your organization. So again, using the example of the people on my teams, there's certain things I can ask Nikki to do that I would not ask Simone to do. There's certain things that I would ask Simone to do I would ask Nikki to do. And there's certain things I wouldn't ask either one of them to do. I would let Josh do it because they're all different. But I have to understand that as a leader where their limitations are. Because there's nothing worse than delegating a task to someone who is not equipped to execute that task and they're getting upset with them because it didn't get executed. I see leaders do this a lot. It falls on you as a leader because your primary job, hear me good, is to make sure that you understand the perimeters of your employees, of your volunteers, or of the people in your organization, particularly your leadership team. Now, people will go, that's a lot of people to be responsible for. No, it's not, because your leadership team should not be that big anyway. We're talking about maybe, with me having 3 teams, my leadership team is about 4 people. That's not a lot of people. And most of the time, you're in constant communication with them anyway. It's just a matter of being mindful over those conversations, what they can and cannot do. Now, if you assign them small tasks, that makes this job easier because now you're able to see what they can do with each assigned task. So again, if I give Nikki, let's say I tell Nikki that her job is to bring in 3 new staffers for the TV team. I get to see how she does an interview. I get to see how she makes phone calls. I get to see how she follows up with tasks to see how good they are at the job. Just giving her that small task, I was able to find out 3 things about her or about her work ethic I would not have known otherwise. Same thing with Simone. If I say, hey Simone, your job this week is to make sure that the content writers pull enough content for 2 or 3 shows in advance. I get to see how she manages those particular tasks. So it's all about practice and it's all about execution. But again, if you do not understand the dynamics or the parameters of your employees, you're going to assign them tasks that they're not going to be able to execute, which is going to cause friction in your organization, which is not something you want to deal with. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago in episodes past about the 3 outlets and the creative, the innovative, frustration. You definitely do not want to encounter them, especially frustration, because if you allow frustration inside your organization, that's a whole other monster you do not want to deal with. So it's easier to take the time to understand the parameters of your employees, of your volunteers. All right, number 4. This is actually important. So checking in with your employees. Let me say up front, there is a difference between checking in with your employees and micromanaging your employees. Micromanaging says, I give you a task that I don't expect you to be able to execute anyway, so I'm going to, in essence, ride you or stay on you every step of the way until it gets done. That is micromanaging. You are not going to get the best out of your employees if you micromanage them. Actually, you're going to be on the fast track to frustration, which, again, leads you down all kinds of dark roads you do not want to deal with. So be mindful of micromanaging. Again, micromanaging, assigning a task that you know they cannot execute or you feel like they cannot execute to either prove a point or to watch them fail. Not a good move. Checking in with your employees says, I assign you a task. I know you can get it done, but I'm still responsible for it at the end of the day, so I'm going to check in periodically. I will do this with the teams. I will assign a task. And oftentimes it's kind of easy. You assign a task. Even though you're busy, you're still communicating with them. And if a couple of days has passed and you're not seeing any progress with that task, then it's okay to say, hey, Nikki, let's have a conversation real quick. So I know I gave you the task of hiring some new interns for the TV team. It's been about 5 days. Just want to check in and see where you are with the process. That is one thing versus saying, okay, Nikki, come in the office. Let's have a conversation about this. I gave you this assignment 3 days ago. It's been 3 days. I'm not seeing any progress. Now you've been a little hostile. And she's going to respond, which we get into emotional intelligence. She's going to respond with that same energy you just gave her. So now you've created friction in that particular moment and nothing's going to get done. So again, checking in with your employees versus micromanaging your employees. And again, I've seen a lot of managers, I won't even say leaders, a lot of managers are not very good with delegation and they quickly run into micromanaging. So always be mindful about the difference. All right, number 5. Be clear about the desired outcome. Very important. What am I saying? If I assign a task to an individual and I am very cryptic about the details of that task, they're probably not going to be able to execute it in the manner by which I would like for it to be done. But that is my fault because I was cryptic about the details of the task. So when you assign individuals on your leadership team tasks, make sure that you're not ambiguous with the task. Make sure you're very clear and precise. Going back to this example with Nicole. Nikki, I need you to hire 3 interns for the television team. Despite how that sounds, that's still very vague. Versus, Nikki, I need you to hire a cameraman, a videographer, and an audio guy for the television team to start 2 weeks from today. Very detailed task versus the very vague task I gave her in the beginning. Because what happens when you give an individual or your leadership vague tasks, or a task that's very vague, then they're left to their own devices to fill in the blanks. Often what happens is they come back to the leader. They executed what you asked them to do, but the manner by which it was done was not to your standard or your liking. But again, it was your fault because you did not give a very detailed assignment sheet to execute what you asked them to do. So always be mindful of that. Be very clear, be very precise about what you're asking them to do and the task that you are assigning them, because in essence, it makes it easier for them to get the job done, and it makes it easier for them to get it done the way you're asking them to get it done. So be clear and concise. Number 6, match the responsibility with the skill set. When I work for individuals, I would hope they would never ask me to do things I could not do. Case in point, let's say I was on my own team and I was an employee and I was working for Nikki. And Nikki says to me, hey, I need you to be the videographer today. She's going to get a very blank stare from me because I know nothing about videography. So it is not going to end well. But as her being the leader or the manager of this particular team, as I said earlier, it is her job to understand where my parameters lie, what I can and cannot do. So in that scenario, Nikki will pass me by when it comes to videography because she knows I have no idea how to get it done. But if she comes to me and says, Ricardo, I need somebody, our VP told us that we need to hire more people for our internship team. I know you're good with administration. Can you take on the task of at least onboarding the people that I've interviewed? Absolutely. I have no problem with that. Administration is a gift of mine. Easily done. It'll be done in how many days? My question is going to be, when do you need it done? I need it done in a day and a half. Got you. Absolutely understand. But she understood that my skill set is in administration, meaning I would be a very viable candidate to execute that particular task. So you have to understand the responsibilities that you're giving someone and their skill set and make sure that those two match, because if not, you're going to create a catastrophe and a frustration not only with the employees but within the organization, because that task is not going to be executed properly. All right? Number 7, include your team in the process. Just because we are leaders and managers does not mean we are a one-man or one-woman team. I don't know any organization where one person can keep their organization alive and keep that organization thriving. It takes a team. And the sooner a leader or a manager understands that ideology, the better off you will be. I cringe whenever I hear a leader says, if you want something done, you have to do it yourself. No. That is an old ideology that needs to be tossed out of the window. Now, if you're going to say if you want something done, make sure that I understand the skill set of my employees, I will agree with that. But to say if you want something done, I have to do it myself, you are setting yourself up for failure, and you're setting yourself up for a lack of delegation, which is not going to serve your organization well. So always include your team in the process. What process? Decision making. Assigning tasks. Whenever you get ready to assign tasks, you should always have somebody close enough to you, or either sit down with a team and let them assign themselves their own tasks. I've actually learned that it's easier. Whenever I get ready to, there's a project we're working on, I sit down with a team and say, okay, this is what we're trying to do. Where do you find yourself in this particular project? And I let them make the decision for themselves. Okay, so when we left off, I was talking about including your team in the process and how important it is to, when you're making decisions, make sure that the people that are on your team feel like they're an intricate part of the decision-making process. Oftentimes we make decisions because we're the leader or we're the manager and we don't need input from anybody else. Well, I have to remind leaders that this is still a democracy. And in democracy, people have opinions, they have thoughts, they have input that they want to put into the decision-making process, especially those who are working in the field. So let's use the example of volunteers. Those individuals that are nonprofit organizations, you have volunteers. Those volunteers are the ones that are working with the people that are utilizing your programs and your services. What does that mean? That means that they will have a greater insight than your executive because they're actually in the trenches working with the people, benefiting from what you offer or what you do. So you definitely want to make sure that you utilize them when you're trying to make decisions, because they understand the dynamics of what you do, not necessarily who you are, but what you do. So let's say your organization is an organization that does health screening for men. Well, you have the people that are actually on the vans that are going from place to place actually doing the health screenings. So when you sit down and say, well, we're trying to decipher if our programs and services are being effective, what do you guys think? And you're talking to a board of executives who don't leave their offices. And there's nothing wrong with that. They have to be administrators. But you want to sit down with the individuals who are actually doing the screenings to say, well, hey, are we seeing the same individuals? Are they following up appropriately? These are the kind of questions you can ask the foot runners, because they're actually doing the work. Same ideology what you guys do. You always want to ask the individuals who are actually working with the people that benefit from your services their input, because not only does it make them feel important, it makes them feel like they're an intricate part of the team, which means they're going to have more pride in what they do. They're going to have more pride with how they do it. They're going to have more pride with who you are. It makes a huge difference. And it's just like the feedback scenario that we were talking about weeks ago about the importance of getting feedback. When you do a survey and you ask your employees, well, hey, what do you think about the organization? What can we do to improve the organization? And they give you a list of a bunch of things. And then you go back to the office and strip out at least a good 75% of it and only execute the 25. Well, if 100 people did the survey and you only utilize 25% of those suggestions, what have you really done? Because now that other 75% feels like, well, I'm not going to say anything else because they didn't listen to anything I said. You want to keep all these things in mind. Always make sure that the individuals on your team feel like they're an intricate part of your team and feel like they're a part of the decision-making process. All right? Avoid upward delegation, or delegating to some person a task that you know they can't complete, that they will have to come back to you to get help. Not a good look. It's actually a handicapping technique, which I see a lot of managers, I won't say necessarily leaders, but a lot of managers will do this. They will give an individual a task and say, I know they can't get it done, but I need to prove a point. They give the employee the task. The employee cannot complete the task because it does not align with their skill set, and then they have to come back to the manager and pretty much ask for help, only for the manager to not really be compliant. All for the sake of trying to prove a point. We do not do this. This is not good leadership. This is not good management. Always assign, we talked about this in step number 3 or 4, always assign individuals responsibilities based on their skill set. That way you know they can execute it, you know they can get it done. Look at it this way. If I assign you a task that you cannot get done, and I'm trying to clear my desk of unnecessary work that I shouldn't be doing anyway, it is not beneficial for me to assign you a task you cannot do. Because now what you're going to do, you're either going to do a very poor job of it, or you're going to leave it to your own devices and doing it. It may not be right, or you're going to have to come back to me, stop me from what I'm doing, because I gave you the task so I can do something else. You're going to have to stop me from what I'm doing. I'm going to have to get back on the project with you, and we just made a complete 360. It does not benefit anybody to assign individual tasks they cannot execute. So avoid upward delegation. Giving people tasks you know they cannot execute in the desire, knowing they have to come back to you to get the help to properly execute the task. It doesn't save anybody any time. It does not promote delegation, proper delegation, and it does not enhance the employees' lives within your organization. So just avoid it. It's not a good look. Set deadlines. The name implies what it is. When you assign tasks or you assign job duties to individuals, make sure that you put a deadline on it. The name is self-explanatory. In the example of giving Nikki, when I gave her the very detailed assignment task, I said, hey, we need a cameraman, a videographer, and an audio guy, and we need them in 2 weeks. And I'll usually ask, do I need to be more specific? Cool. Then I need them by June 5th. Do you need a time? I need them on June 5th by 3 o'clock because that's when we shoot. Sometimes you have to be that specific with individuals. But it also goes to the perimeters of individuals. Within my 3 teams, there are very detailed individuals. So I know when I speak to them, I have to be that detailed. That it has to be a time, it has to be a date, it has to be a number, and it has to be given within a certain confine of wherever we're going to be. Then there are other individuals who I can just assign a concept and they can execute it. Hey, I need a commercial. I need it to be the heading for the show. I need it not to be any longer than 3 minutes, and I need it in 2 weeks. Sometimes that's all I have to give some individuals on some of my teams, and they can execute it. They don't ask me any more questions, and the only time I see it, I just see the finished product. Then I have those middle guys, the ones who need enough details, but not too much details to confine them. Those are usually my creatives. They need some parameters because if not, they'll be jumping off the rooftops, doing all kinds of crazy stuff. But at the same token, if I don't give them enough to actually start the project, it'll never get started. So you have your very detail-oriented people, you have your middle guys, and then you have the lax guys, or what I like to call them the lax guys. But everybody should have a deadline because in giving people deadlines, they understand that there's a little fire under their feet and that they need to get the job done in a timely manner. And that timely manner goes off their leader. Because again, I've met leaders who will give assignments and chores and tasks, and they're not asking any more questions until that task is up. Then I've also met other leaders and managers who micromanage and make everybody's life terrible, who are going to stay on you until you finish what they asked you to finish within a time frame, which is never specified. So always make sure you give deadlines and make sure you're very detailed about what you're asking your employees or your volunteers to do. And I said volunteers because just because you're not paying individuals, let me say this. Just because you're not paying individuals does not mean that there should not be a standard or a level of expectation. The mere fact that you chose to volunteer within this organization means that you understand there's a certain level of commitment that is expected of you, whether you're receiving a paycheck or not. This goes for ministries, because oftentimes I see leaders who are put on boards or things like that, and they never come through because they feel like, well, I'm not getting paid for it. Well, unfortunately, you knew that when you became a part of the leadership board at the church, or you knew that when you became a volunteer for your nonprofit. So leaders, do not let the lack of resources or the lack of compensation, monetary compensation, stop you from creating a standard and holding everybody within your organization to that standard. It is still expected. Because if not, you're going to end with a bunch of people who feel like they're doing you a favor, and that never ends well. So keep that in the back of your mind. Because like I said, I see that a lot within ministries and nonprofits. All right, so let's do a recap. Number one, evaluate what you can and cannot do. When I say you, I'm talking about the leader or the manager. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Where are there opportunities to delegate between those two? What are your threats? Number two, defer when you need to. Understanding what you can and cannot do and what you can take off your plate and delegate to individuals because they can get the job done. Number three, let your employees or your volunteers surprise you. Actually, I might have skipped that one. But really quickly, let them surprise you. What does that mean? Assign them to, you know their skill set. Assign them a task that will force them to tap into a skill set they don't even realize they have, but you know they have because you understand what they can do. Let them surprise you. Or sometimes I've had people from my teams ask me, hey, can I try such and such and such? And where I would normally say no, I'm like, you know what? Sure, give it a go. I've been pleasantly surprised by what they can do. Number four, check in with your employees. Remember, check in, not micromanage. Number five, be clear about your desired outcomes. What is expected of you on this task? Number six, match their responsibilities with the skill set. Make sure whatever you assign them is within their wheelhouse of skill sets that they can get done. Number seven, include them in the team process. Number eight, avoid upward delegation. And number nine, set deadlines. All these things combined will make delegation easier and get the best out of your employees.